Give me a second. It's active. Right. Okay, then.
Yeah, talking about inline environments, where I made 2 PRs, one, the original one with a single inline environment, so you can edit the spec on the JSON level, which was at least 2 issues that were asking for.
Maybe let's just link and share to these, otherwise nobody will understand what we're talking about if watching this afterwards. So
I can maybe share the issue too. Or you? Oh yeah, you should.
Yeah,
Great.
I'll be sharing my screen.
It's right on top.
This probably starts with inline environments.
4.3, yeah. 4.3 is where the
right
discussion happens. So we had 2 issues that came up. Like, one wants to edit the API server because you use a local Kubernetes cluster, and the other one I forgot was something similar. That was directly talking about inline environments. So yeah, and then I worked out on a weekend how we could do it as simple as possible.
So this one is still about the more basic thing of just
like
moving the environments back into JSON, right?
And then use the data bit of the spec to encapsulate the main.json.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think we discussed this before. That I still think like it has drawbacks, but it also solves problems. Like especially the fact that GitLab requested where we can dynamically generate the API server IP. So that's cool, definitely. What you've written below here, that like, yeah, TKenv is basically broken at this point, because it would need to evaluate every single environment, basically, to understand it.
Yeah.
There would be an option around it if we say that like this stanza needs to be at the top level. Then we could just partially evaluate these files and try to check whether a file has a kind environment key, and then just say, yeah, this is one. But this
I
would...
I found a solution for that. So you can render the specs without the data by just setting data to null, and then it doesn't render that, and JSON is fast.
Yeah, and that's probably lightning fast, I think. At least I guess.
Yeah.
So this should be fine. What's the second thing? TK complete. Yeah. So there was something below here what Craig said about having either spec.json and main.json, or on that regard. So I think we can't just assume that we are running in inline mode when spec.json is missing, because we had some, I think even documented behavior before, which explicitly allowed not having a spec.json. So maybe, at least I think another way would be here to say we either, like, if you hand me a directory, then I expect spec.json to be present, or like then I operate under the old mode. And if you hand me a plain file, in that case, I expect to be running in inline mode.
I was thinking the other way around, by rendering the JSON, check if we have an environment kind in there. If so, use it. If not, we try to use the spec.json. If that's not there, then we resort to the local hosting that you mentioned. We don't assume it's an environment. You render it from a directory. If there's no environment object there, then we can check if there is a spectral JSON object. But if there's an environment object, we can assume that we can ignore spectral JSON.
Yeah, or do we just ignore it, or should we instead update it so that legacy Tanka versions still work?
Yeah.
Like, I sort of don't want to create the fact where it's ambiguous. So,
but legacy won't work because the environment object will be the old version will try to execute the environment object against Kubernetes.
That's true.
Kubernetes-like object.
Yeah, like that's the reason why it might be a better idea to like split that on the way of invoking. So like you can't invoke legacy Tanka, like Tanka up to date on files. You can only invoke it on directories because we did not release your PR yet.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of still got a chance to say that like single files are always inline environments. Right?
Yeah. Not necessarily, but
like would be an option.
I like what you said earlier in response to this PR. You said we should only have one way. And it's like, just on the next version, we say don't use spectral JSON anymore. Here's your migration process.
Yeah. Oh, hello. Somebody's joining.
Yeah.
Hey.
Hello, Rick.
Welcome.
Hey, good morning.
Hey.
Good afternoon.
We're talking about inline environments in Tanka.
Right. So
Perfect.
Just for setting expectations, maybe you want to just let us know how experienced you are with Tanka?
Rick?
Yeah, so I've been using it to deploy to our stage and production systems for, I don't know, a couple months now.
Wow, cool.
And I've actually so I was using it for, so I ported a lot of like third-party, like logging and whatnot, Helm charts over to JSON it, and it was deploying with Tanka, and I was using it only for our production configs. And now I've just actually moved all of our end-to-end test environments and all of production and stage deployments over to JSON it and Tanka. So, yeah, I'd say fairly familiar with it, I would say. So it's probably been, I think, yeah, I would say since August, I guess I've been using it in production. So,
Awesome.
yeah, so the inline environments is definitely a great topic, because I've been, yeah, so especially for things like end-to-end tests, I've had to do some kind of ugly hacks in order to, deploy to arbitrary namespaces that I just created. So yeah, being able to just create a new environment on the fly and deploy to it would be fantastic.
Cool.
Yeah, so for our end-to-end test environment, I create a new subdomain, new namespace, that is just basically a randomly generated namespace. And then, so in order to do that in Tanka right now, I basically have to create a new temporary directory, copy the stuff into it, make some tweaks, and then use that as the component directory, right, to deploy from. It works, but it's just a little hacky.
All right, that's true.
Great. Use cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to know. Like, cool. So for where were we at? I think we're about deprecation schedule, right?
Yeah, we're just to get you up to speed. We're discussing some implementation details, like how are we going to make that available. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. So let me just collect my thoughts again. Yeah, exactly. So do you think I would like to prevent us having basic and advanced mode? Because that makes it super hard to use, actually. Like when you need to explain to people that you have the basic mode they will start with, and then afterwards they need to go to an advanced mode. That sort of sounds like we were not able to unify these to some common denominator. So yeah, let's try to figure out how to like use JSON it only.
Yeah, I like that
So
too. It's like we do want to support the spec.json way, so we don't have to ask everybody to port their old code over.
Well, we only need to support it if we can port it over automatically, right? Like a new TK version could also just silently include that. Well, I know it can't because it cannot edit main.json. It's tricky.
So we have to create a new.
Like we probably need to support it for like 3 release cycles, and then we could deprecate it. Or
we could deprecate it like in the Java way, where we say deprecate it, but keep supporting it for as long as viable. And then, because there are things in Java, for example, that have been deprecated in 2002 and still work.
yeah,
it just says don't use it.
I think that's a bad idea because like if nothing's going to happen with like when deprecated means it's labeled but nothing happens, then nobody will change anything. So we should probably make clear like it will be away in 3 months exactly.
Yeah. And what about saying this is naming this alpha now or beta? Saying it will replace that?
Well, I think this only matters if we can decide how we want to do it. So
yeah, sure.
I'm still not completely sold on the way.
Mm-hmm. But when you say we can't edit main.json, actually we can, because we just put everything that's in main.json inside data. So you can do it.
No, I mean, if we wanted to you can't just put everything in there because there might be some syntactical constructs you can't inline at this place without danger. Like if we would create broken JSON files, that would be fatal.
Yeah, too many edge cases.
So
it would work for the happy flow, but it doesn't work for all cases.
Yeah, like in a simple case, it would work perfectly fine, but
if you do an import TK or import spec.json, then that would be a bit freaking hard.
Yeah, what about import TK? We can't support that any further, right?
We can, but not with the env.
Not with
env. So
yeah, well, then it's pointless. Like this is existing behavior, and I'm sure people are using it. So
yeah,
can we fix that in some way?
Yeah, the problem is that you need the spec.json env first before you can start a JSON VM.
Yeah, well, in theory, there should be no need for tk.env if your environment is inline anyways. So
Yeah. If you have this
think
top
it would be
level
fair-
environment, then you can say then that won't have a TK import.
well, I can have a tk import, but like just calling tkn would raise an error.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, so like maybe
that's a hard question to break. To want to break that.
well, yeah, maybe explain to me again why you would like to have this data key and not just have the environment as another resource in the stream, which like from an implementation perspective, it would be far simpler to just filter it out.
It implies that what you have in an environment in a main.jsonnet with a spec.json, there you tell exactly this is the data and this is your environment. When you just add another object in your JSONet, I think you break that relationship into two separate pieces. There's no relationship anymore.
Well, there is, as long as we ensure that only one environment can exist in that stream.
Yeah, I think this is much cleaner. Also, if you want to do something else than environment, you can assume here that whatever is in data belongs to that environment. But when you don't add it to data, add it somewhere else in the JSON, then you assume it belongs there, but there's no direct relationship with the environment.
Right. That's true. But does it... I can see an obvious drawback of this being a bit less obvious.
Like, what's the drawback?
No, I can't see one. So, like, what's the problem with these being on the same level versus these having that obvious relation?
Just that single environment object that we have. Thinking beyond what Tanka is now. Think about what Tanka can be in the future. And then you have multiple things, not only an environment, but maybe also an object that executes Terraform. Just thinking out loud here. Then you would first execute the Terraform thing to create your cluster, and then use the environment to apply stuff to the cluster. Just thinking out loud here, right? I have no strict plans for that. I just
So what is the so without this data? I guess what is Tom? What is your intended? I guess mechanism for including the main JSONet, the top level JSONet object. If it's not like this, yeah, I'm just curious to know, because so if it's an inline environment, that implies that I should be able to say, this file represents my environment, or this object represents my environment, and this file represents my JSONet main. When I just run Tanka, right? So that means I should be able to point to two different files anywhere on my file system, and just execute Tanka against those, right?
Yeah, so like the idea here on hand with this pull request was that you have like currently at the top level value of the JSON evaluation is considered by Tanka as some sort of collection, which it scans through to find any kind of Kubernetes object, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of changes it a bit, that at the top level, we now would strictly expect an object of this form. Like this is what was before spec.json, which would now have to be emitted by JSONnet. And what was previously at the top level would be inlined under the data key. which tightly couples like environment configuration and environment data.
Right. So I
And
guess if we leave out the data field there, what would be the alternative?
well,
Like,
if
do we
we
just
left out the data field,
specify
then we could maybe think of the exactly the same way as it is at the moment. We scrape the big tree for whatever looks like a Kubernetes object. And because this also looks like a Kubernetes object, we would also find this while scanning and would then just filter it out and read the configuration from there. So it would be on the same level instead of enclosing the data.
I see. So it's okay. So this is a matter, in some ways, I guess this example here kind of is a mechanism for kind of enforcing a hierarchy, where this has to sit on top of the object hierarchy, whereas in the alternative approach, it can be found anywhere in the generated data.
Yes, exactly.
I got it now. Okay. I'm trying to think of a use case where I wouldn't want, or I guess I'm trying to think of a use case where I wouldn't want some object like this to be at the top level of my JSON objects. Does help clean things up a bit. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the only advantage I could think of offhand is just in long-term maintenance, keeping, like, I guess what would happen if, some JSON and file got included and all of a sudden I ended up with two environment objects in this mess of objects, right? One lib includes another lib, which includes another lib, which includes some vendored thing, and then we end up with two environment objects in the resulting JSON expansion.
Well,
I guess
if we did it in any way, I think for starters, a good idea would be to just fail in case we occur two of them, because that's ambiguous and sort of makes no sense.
Yeah,
I know your run has a pull request for allowing to have multiple environments in one evaluation, but that's probably a different story.
Yeah. So I think even if there wasn't this kind of data object, right? Because that's really what this does, is this kind of implies that this becomes the entry point of the Tanka program that gets executed, right? So even if that data object wasn't required, I think we would probably end up adopting a very similar convention, just so it was very clear like what the entry points were, right? It's like every yeah. But at the same time, I guess, it'd be nice to have flexibility not to, because sometimes I want to run, like when you're working with Node.js or Python or whatever, sometimes it's nice to, most of the time you want to execute what you consider to be main, but sometimes you just want to execute a single file just to test something or see if it works. At which point it would be nice to just be able to inject the environment object into that just to make it deploy and just to test that one subset of the source files.
So I think what bothers me a bit with the current approach outlined by the PR is that it strictly requires that boilerplate. So there is no way around having this schema set up. While when you had the environment
the thing, what I did in multiple environments, the second PR on this, actually allows for that we can put the environment nested, so it doesn't have to be a top level. We just filter out that we only want one. If we find more than one, we fail there, which is cleaner than what we are doing now.
I think it's not. My comment was not about it not being at the top level, but rather at the moment you can, like, if you just took a single deployment and put it at the top level, that would be still valid and would still execute just fine, which I personally found quite handy when trying things out just quickly. While with this, I at least always would need to include that, which I think might block some use cases or makes me type that more often. And if it was just another element in the top level, nobody, like, with the current way, and yeah, carry on.
Yeah, sorry, sorry to interrupt, but
No
I'm
problem.
thinking that I think there's a very simple compromise here, and that is that you could actually achieve both. Just make the data block optional, but if there are multiple environment objects found in the JSON rendering, then the data object becomes required, because now you have to specify what becomes the entry point for this particular deployment. So you could actually generate 2 deployments from one Tanka run with 2 environments and 2 data blobs pointing at two different mains. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
definitely I do.
the data block only becomes required when you need to disambiguate. So really, you
I
could
think
actually.
that becomes harder to program because you have to support both cases.
It certainly does.
Does it? I mean, how much harder though? Like, I don't know. Like,
Yeah, the first, if you include it in the data block, then you make sure you can render an environment. If you can't render an environment, you can't continue. If you put the data block outside of it, then you can render the data, render the environment, and make sure that the environment is not in your data. So you have to do a lot more checks. A lot more is exaggerated here, but you have to check that your environment is not in the data you pass along to kubectl, which is a bit. If you can do that and decide that on the JSON level, then why would you make it more complex in Tanka?
I can't really think of a reason to do that. Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Well, so the problem I just realized while we had this discussion with what this approach might impose is, with the current way, everybody keeps their resources at the top level, and this will sort of require them to wrap all of their code into this structure, even though they might create a new file and just import main.json it. But this would also be something we would need to communicate, and that might confuse newcomers. While if we just allowed the environment to be at the same level, it would just be like a 5-line addition to the existing main.json file without changing all indentation for everything else. So my gut feeling is I'm in favor of keeping these decoupled and having environment just as a loose resource. But this is certainly not to me to decide alone. So
yeah,
I'm kind of leaning towards that as well. My take is, and again, I'm just one opinion here, but the biggest, maybe not the biggest, but one of the biggest hurdles for me in learning the Tanka approach was, so I have N clusters and M environments within each cluster, and my approach for implementing this, I guess, was to have the main, right? So what was main JSON it? Like my intuition was to make that almost identical for every single cluster, right? Which point I'm just kind of copy pasting across the same kind of component across a bunch of different environments, and that was, and then I would only differentiate by like a config that I would pass in, like would be like top level arguments, and in order to adopt the existing Tanka paradigm, I basically had to move all of that common code into lib and put my context into each main JSON it. And it was just I don't know, it was a little bit So I'm thinking like, if I can move to a system where I don't have to have one directory for every combination of cluster and environment, the way I guess I would want to do that is yeah, basically just as I just described. So I generate this environment object as part of this job. I'm not maybe not explaining this too well, but I guess I would, what I want to try to avoid is having n times m environment objects in code when they're all 90% similar, and the only thing that changes is the API server and the namespace, right?
Right. So
Yeah,
I think this is
so I
super
guess-
interesting because this is a core problem of the Spectre JSON approach. But like, how would you like to do it differently? Like, you could certainly create a main.json that generates all of that for you, that environment object. But how would you data get in? How would you specify which environment you actually want to apply? Like, would you create
I would
a new
I
file
would make
for
a top level.
each?
Yeah, I would either ext vars or top level argument function, right? So the function, I'd have one main JSONet that takes the environment variables of API server and namespace and cluster name, and every time in it, and then so I'd have n times m invocations of Tanka that change the variable each time. Because I don't want to deploy all of them every time. I only, every time I deploy, I'm only interested in deploying to a single cluster, right? So yeah, so I think that using this approach, that I would just parameterize the entire deployment with 3 variables that would create this new environment on the fly.
Okay. So
I realize as I say that now, either the required data field or unrequired data field could work, but it seems, I don't know, to me, I guess, a bit more natural to not have.
You would then like to use some external automation, such as makefiles or something, to feed in these, or where would you like to store?
They would actually be executed in my CI system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, so basically, some other automation system would be executing these.
Yeah, so currently Tanka is pretty opinionated on that, and this sort of was for a purpose, because when you have a file, or for that regards a directory for each environment, it's quite easy by just looking at the directory tree what exists, and by looking into each files, like consider you have like an abstract environment somewhere, you have a lib which includes all of the common things of all your environments. And then when just looking at the individual environment files, you could easily see how these divert from the common one, which I think is a property that's quite important. And might happen that if you, for example, used what you just described, where you inject this data from the outside at runtime, then this highly comes down to how people code, but I might imagine somebody to be a bit less careful there, and then, for example, want to have a single option set on a single environment or a single system, or server, or cluster, and then they would maybe just use an if switch instead of JSON to react on whatever the X value was set to, at which point we are at something I would highly like to discourage, because this becomes super unobvious what happens.
Right. No, that's understandable. I guess my take was just following the DRY principle, that I wanted to modularize as much as possible. Also, in a lot of cases, literally the only difference between a lot of our deployments is the namespace. And so it seems certainly having the structure it has now, when the only desire is to change the namespace of the target deployment, is definitely far too heavyweight. So I think there's a balance. There's a balance there for sure.
Yeah. So like maybe if we inlined the environment, you would no longer need directories. Single files would do at this point.
Yep.
And
I would still, I think, I would like to have the option to import, a configuration context, on a per deployment basis, which means I might dynamically generate that data object there and say import, cluster foo JSON it, import cluster bar JSON it, etc. So I guess, I don't know, thinking through that rather complicated use case, I guess it doesn't really change whether there's a required data blob or not. I don't think it would change how I would structure everything. So maybe all that talking, I haven't really helped clarify anything.
Yeah.
yep,
I think
still very cool discussion.
for me, it's something I didn't consider really as an option to say you make the data block optional. So saying either try to find whatever you need for your environment in the JSON or use the data block. I guess when you have the data block, you can be sure you're on the right track there, because then you know the exact relationship. Yeah.
Yep.
That was at least my main motivation. But I guess not everybody wants to refactor it like this. On the other hand, by keeping the support for spec.json for a while, people don't have to. And I don't see much problem in supporting spec.json for a while, at least a couple months. I don't want to refactor the whole code base at Grafana for that.
All right. We are coming to an end here. 3 minutes left, so
Yeah.
Was a nice discussion, definitely. And we need to carry on with that.
Yeah, it's something that we don't want to move too fast because it decides a
No, definitely
few basic things, like fundamental things on how Tanka works. If you want to change this behavior in the future, then it becomes much harder. Again.
Yeah, exactly. Like we have one shot here, and if we miss it, that it will be very hard to reiterate. Right, but thanks Rick and Jeremy for sharing their experiences. So
yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
Hey, thanks for putting this on, guys.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Right.
Sure. Then see you all in exactly 1 month, same time.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye bye.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.